Thanks to everyone for turning out. My name is Matthew Hyman. On behalf of the International and National Security Law Practice Group at the Federalist Society and the National Security Institute at the Scalia Law School at George Mason University, we are delighted to be hosting today's panel, and we're especially appreciative of the panelists for getting together on what we think will be a very interesting topic. Just a word about the practice group. We do programming like this throughout the year, whether it's teleforum calls that become podcasts or live events like these. If you're interested in the work of the practice group, you can find me here at the convention or check out the website and send an email to Erica Monkwitz, and we're happy to get people involved. Likewise, the National Security Institute is very much focused on law and policy matters as they relate to national security, and this is part and parcel of the kind of work that NSI does, and I'm delighted to say that two of our three panelists are advisory board members at the National Security Institute, and our moderator has taught some courses with us at the National Security Institute, so we're well represented. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's moderator. Judge Gregory Katsas was appointed to the DC Circuit in December 2017. Prior to joining the bench, Judge Katsas served as a law clerk to Judge Edward Becker on the Third Circuit, to then Judge Clarence Thomas on the DC Circuit, and subsequently to Justice Thomas on the Supreme Court. In addition to that work, Judge Katsas had a couple of stints with the Jones Day law firm where his focus practiced on appellate and complex litigation. From 2001 to 2009, he served in a number of positions at the Department of Justice, including Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Division and Acting Associate Attorney General. In 2017, he served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Counsel to the President. And with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Judge Katsas.
Thank you. Thank you. So I spent many years at DOJ in the Civil Division defending national security initiatives. We spent most of our time dealing with a set of cases involving detainees and whether they could be held at Guantanamo Bay, whether they could be tried by military commission, whether they could be subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques. Another set of cases involving signals intelligence, use of a presidentially authorized terrorist surveillance program, and then the later statutory authorization. And those cases occupied a huge part of my time. But there was a third prong of counterterrorism operations at the time, much less visible perhaps, and certainly generating much less litigation. So I am not a subject matter expert in this, but the economic weapons. Fortunately, we have three folks here today who served with me and who are subject matter experts in that area and are going to enlighten us all in that area. So let me just introduce our distinguished panel in the order in which they will be speaking. John Yoo is the Emanuel Heller Professor of Law at the University of California at Berkeley, a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. His latest book, co-authored with Jeremy Rabkin, is called Striking Power: How Cyber, Robots, and Space Weapons Change the Rules for War. He has written many other books, nearly 100 scholarly articles on subjects including war and peace, national security, constitutional law, international law, and the Supreme Court. He served in all three branches of government, including as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel, as General Counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee under Chairman Orrin Hatch, and as a law clerk to Judge Lawrence Silberman, one of my very distinguished colleagues on the DC Circuit, and to Justice Thomas. He's a graduate of Harvard College and Yale Law School. Ambassador Kristen Silverberg is an executive vice president at the Business Roundtable, where she leads its policy team. She's also served as a managing director at the Institute of International Finance. During the Bush administration, she served as ambassador to the European Union, assistant secretary of state for international organization affairs, and as deputy domestic policy advisor in the White House. In 2003, she received the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service, rendered in Baghdad, Iraq. She formerly practiced law at Williams and Connolly and served as a law clerk to Judge David Santel, another of my very distinguished colleagues on the DC Circuit, and also to Justice Thomas on the Supreme Court. She's a graduate of Harvard College and the University of Texas Law School. And finally, Juan Zarate is chairman and co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network, chairman of the Center on Economics and Financial Power, and a senior national security analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He also serves as a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and as a senior fellow at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center. His books include Treasury's War, published in 2013, and Forging Democracy, published in 1994. From 2005 to 2009, he served as a deputy assistant to the president and as deputy national security advisor responsible for counterterrorism efforts. He also served as the first assistant secretary of the Treasury for terrorist financing and financial crimes. He's prosecuted terrorism cases for the federal government, and for 8 years he was a visiting lecturer in law at Harvard Law School. John is going to lead off talking about economic sanctions. Kristen will follow up speaking about some trade authorities, and Juan will conclude with some AML-type issues and maybe frame some broader questions for further discussion. So, John.
Well, thank you.
No, you don't need to clap for the moderator.
Well, thank you very much, Judge Katsas. It's great to be able to call you Judge, not just Greg, as I used to for most of my life. I'm glad you all are here, especially given the competing panels. There's one on guns going on right now, one on free speech, but everyone in this room knows what really makes the world go round: money. Right? So welcome to the money panel. I'm also glad to see a lot of my friends from the New York City chapter here. Judge Mukasey here prominently, my good friend. So we all know which chapter in all the chapters in America cares the most about the money, which is the New York City chapter. I also just want to say it's great to be on this panel. Greg just went through all the tough issues that gave him so much work in the Justice Department, like Gitmo and the terrorist surveillance program. But I thought all that up because I wanted to get you back for something. And what I wanted to get you back is I met Greg for the first time when I interviewed for a clerkship with Justice Thomas. And so we had this interview. And then he said, come with me. I want to show you oral argument, an opinion announcement. So I said, oh, okay. I mean, I'm just finished my third year in law school. So I go to Greg. He takes me up to watch an opinion announcement. I have no idea what opinion is going to be announced. And it turns out to be Casey versus Planned Parenthood in southeastern Pennsylvania. Greg, I think, I'm just out of law school. I'm trying to think, is this consistent with the Roe versus Wade framework? I think Greg's watching my face carefully to see every reaction that comes out during the statements. And then I didn't get the clerkship. So, Gitmo, TSP is my revenge on you for that very, very terrible judgment you made. It's
Eventually you got it.
Eventually I got it after you left office. And then to my right is Kristen Silverberg, who then I might say I interviewed for a clerkship, and I didn't make her go watch any oral arguments or weird opinion announcements or see her reactions to Justice Kennedy in real time. We gave her the job. It was an obvious choice, and I'm glad to see that she has pursued it a much more interesting life than most other Thomas clerks have had. One, we worked together when we were both very young in the National Security Council and the Justice Department. And two things. First, Juan is not a former Thomas clerk, so he's the liberal on the panel. And you'll notice all the Thomas clerks kept their hair. Yeah. So something about not clerking for Thomas and hair loss. Maybe the justice should do commercials for hair, baldness remedies.
I would have applied.
But it's great to see Juan. We haven't seen each other for 15 years probably. It's great to be on the panel with you. So let me just very quickly, now that I've consumed my time, thank God, I wasn't really sure what to talk about. But then over lunch, I sat next to the former Undersecretary of the Treasury in charge of sanctions. So I was able to ask her all these questions about what really had happened in the last 2 years. So, which I had suspected but had not been sure about. So one thing she told me, which I had thought just from general impression, is that the Trump administration has used more economic sanctions and more economic leverage as a tool of foreign policy than any administration in the past. Oops, sorry. I think one reason for this, of course, is because of President Trump's desire to realign American commitments abroad with our resources. And if we're going to be drawing down on our deployments abroad, then it seems obvious economic sanctions are going to increase as a preferred tool of foreign policy. But the other thing she mentioned, also you get glimmers of this in cases and opinions, is also the way sanctions are being used. So we are continuing sanctions in places like North Korea, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, Syria, Turkey, on again, off again, and so on. But we're also, the administration is doing something different in the way it's using the sanctions. You might have noticed, in particular, the administration is using what are called secondary sanctions, I think much more broadly than any previous administration. This is where you don't just sanction the country, but you also sanction any business or person who's connected to the U.S. financial system that has any business with the sanctioned countries. So that's the second. And that's a tool that first came to use in the Reagan administration in the first term when the United States tried to stop European companies from cooperating with the construction of a pipeline with the Soviet Union. But I think this administration has really put that kind of sanctions on steroids. And so not just the countries, but the numbers of people and organizations that the Treasury Department has pursued, I think has gone up dramatically. And then the other area where you've seen economic leverage used as a tool for foreign policy has been in trade, of course. Of course, I think one major shift that the Trump administration has caused in our foreign policy that will survive him, I think a remarkable change to create a kind of bipartisan agreement in the foreign policy establishment has been the nature of China and its rise and what we have to do in response. And the Trump administration has used all the levers, I think, of economic power, aside from direct IEEPA sanctions themselves, but in the trade area to try to counter some of the abuses by China in international relations. However, we also do it to some of our allies, and this is where I think Trump's been most controversial. He's also used trade sanctions on Canada and Mexico, and he's used trade sanctions or threatened them on our Western European allies, and on Japan, and on South Korea, right? And on Turkey. He's been using the threat of breaking trade agreements or tariffs, trade barriers in order to leverage into some kind of foreign policy achievement. So very briefly, my only take on this before I turn it over to the real experts is I think there are two interesting legal consequences of this. One is when the United States uses economic sanctions versus the other normal tools of power like diplomacy or the military. In the separation of powers world, what does that lead to? It leads to an increase in Congress's role, because Congress under Article 1 controls foreign international commerce as well as domestic commerce. That gives Congress more ability to pursue a foreign policy that's at odds with that of the White House. Right? Congress can impose sanctions over the veto of a president. Right? It can't order the military to launch a strike if the president disagrees with it. Theoretically, I don't know if this is actually how it turns out, but you would think Congress can't order our diplomats to act or do certain things if it's in contradiction with the president's control of foreign affairs. So this is where we get to impeachment, right? You've all been waiting for. Why are we all having panels on free speech and the Second Amendment? We all really want to talk about impeachment, right? Let's talk about impeachment. So if you think about impeachment, what's going on with Ukraine and the hearings today with Ambassador Yovanovitch and George Kent and William Taylor, these are all about, a conflict between the president's foreign policy towards Ukraine and Congress's preferred policy towards Ukraine. Congress wanted to be more generous to Ukraine, allocated $400 million to go to Ukraine. The president clearly has a dimmer view of Ukraine than is held by many of the leaders in Congress. And so what do we have? We have a constitutional confrontation and an impeachment proceeding even going on because of Congress's greater constitutional authority when we use economic sanctions or economic benefits as a foreign policy tool. During Q&A, let's, though, talk about whether this is an impeachable offense or a high crime and misdemeanor, whether the House owes due process, whether the Senate trial, what it has to look like. But just the broader picture is, if it weren't like this, President Trump, suppose President Trump had said, do me this favor, look into that Hunter guy and look into this CrowdStrike thing, and there was no $400 million at stake. Would there be an impeachable question at all? Right? So it's one way to think about what's going on now is you go down this road, over the long run, you are giving Congress more and more power over foreign policy. And then just the last point, and then I'll close, is there's also an interesting international law consequence. So President Trump, of course, doesn't want to use force as much, does not want to have heavy military deployments abroad, prefers to use economic sanctions. International law favors this as well. However, we should ask ourselves, is this actually the better way to coerce other countries? Yes, military force kills people. Economic sanctions, what is the theory of it? We make life miserable for a whole population of another country. We force them to undergo economic suffering in the hopes that they will impose political pressure on their leaders or even overthrow the government. Right? That's the theory behind economic sanctions. So, think about it. What is the trade-off between using military force versus economic sanctions in terms of the harm it puts on another country? And if we are going to go down this road where we prefer imposing greater harms on a country because they're more diffuse and more spread out, why don't we go down that road with cyber and all the other new kinds of technologies that have available? So if we're going to impose tough economic sanctions on Iran in the hopes that cutting them off from the world financial system will cause the people to undergo food shortages, undergo economic collapse, and demand a change in their leadership, why don't we use cyber weapons to do the same thing? They're much more targeted. Why can't we use cyber weapons to target critical parts of a rival country's infrastructure, like the banking system or stock markets or distribution and transportation networks? Actually, those would be in so many ways far less harmful than broad-based economic sanctions, more targeted and might achieve our goals. Right now, actually, since the early Obama years, this is something that our military and intelligence services have really resisted, the idea of using cyber in this way. But I would say, what is the difference in terms of cost benefit or morally from using that when we're always only too happy to use these broad-based economic sanctions? So thank you very much for giving me a chance to join you. I look forward to the questions and answers.
Well, thank you. It's really great to be here with these friends and former colleagues, although I have to say that John has much fonder memories of my screening interview for Justice Thomas than I do. He did not show me Casey, but he did ask me the questions about all the con law cases that show up as a tiny footnote in your textbook.
Those are all the ones I clerked at the court for. That's why I was asking.
And then kind of grilled me when I, tried to scramble through it. So I always say that that's when I first learned about his views on enhanced interrogation. So I thought I'd take a minute to talk about some of the trade issues which John introduced and which are really putting us as a country into some uncharted waters. As you know, for modern American history, the U.S. has had one set of national security adversaries and then one set of economic competitors, but without a lot of overlap. So at the height of the Soviet Union, they had a GDP that was about half the GDP of the US. They weren't really competitors in any sense. Moreover, our economies were so separated from each other. Soviets accounted for about 1% of US trade, slightly more than that for some of our Western European allies. And their principal trading partners were countries like North Korea and Cuba. So at the time, it was fine for us to say, we'll go our way, you go your way, and with no real consequences. And of course, now we're entering this phase, as John was mentioning, with an entirely different landscape. Our principal national security adversary and our principal economic competitor are the same country, and we have vast economic ties. So our economies are sort of closely linked, and there are real dangers to trying to unlink them, partly because we would be saying that U.S. companies are going to kind of abandon this massive Chinese market and potentially some other countries in the region and leave them to Chinese firms to dominate. Anyway, I think this is going to raise a kind of whole host of issues about our trade authorities and trade policies, and we can talk about a lot of those in the Q&A. The one I wanted to focus on was the one that John mentioned around separation of powers. And the question of this balance between executive and congressional authorities in the trade area. So I think that you all know the history of this very well, but since early in the 20th century, Congress has delegated extraordinary powers to the president to regulate trade. That could be in the context of an emergency, could be in the context of unfair trading practices. And I think that the China example will tempt a lot of presidents, not just President Trump, but all of his successors, to make full use of those authorities. But I think there's a real question about whether that delegation is just sort of part of our modern constitutional order and the way that things are going to move forward, or whether we've given the executive too much authority in a way that could potentially undermine consistency and the rule of law going forward. So up until about the 1930s, Congress had exercised its constitutional authorities over trade quite directly. It would pass detailed tariff schedules, for example, and you would see kind of horse trading in Congress where you'd agree, when you'd get a protectionist measure in support of this district and a protectionist measure over here. And of course, all of that culminated in Smoot-Hawley. And the backlash to Smoot-Hawley was for Congress to start to give authority to the president to start negotiating decreases in tariffs. And that set off this long period of trade liberalization, which mostly kind of proceeded that way for the next 3/4 of a century. Along the way, and sometimes as a way of getting support for trade liberalization, Congress also delegated to the president authorities to bring the hammer down when necessary. And those all work, there are lots of them, and they all work in slightly different ways, but basically they require a kind of threshold decision from the president that there's a national emergency or there's a threat to national security, and then they kind of unleash a host of authorities. So Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 allows the president to impose tariffs in response to a national security threat. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 allows him to take action in response to different unfair trade practices. And then IEEPA, actually which one may end up talking about it, which we normally think of as a kind of sanctions authority, requires the president to declare a national emergency. But then if he does that, it just sets loose this whole bundle of authorities to deal with cross-border activity. And the upshot of all of these delegations combined is that the president now has authority to set tariff rates, quota levels, and restrict cross-border trade, all without any congressional involvement. This was all kind of a footnote on trade policy until 2016 when, President Trump getting elected with this, as John was saying, this sort of strong bipartisan consensus that there was imbalance in our trading relationship with China, decided to dust off some of these provisions and has used them, of course, not only for China, but also around trade issues with Europe, steel and aluminum imports, and so on. We now have tariffs on about 15% of total goods imports, 2/3 of the goods from China, and which equals about $365 billion, all without congressional approval. Now, just to be clear, I think the president was acting in response to some genuine and legitimate grievances and threats from China. Intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, state-owned enterprises, a lot of market distorting activities. But I think that the balance on the sort of unilateral tariff increases as a tool of foreign policy is upsetting the balance between congressional and executive powers. And it's not balancing the need for sort of deliberate action against deliberation, which is what our system is meant to protect. And I also think it's raising some precedential issues. So when you think about, even if you're happy with the way that President Trump has exercised them because you agree with his goals on China, would you be equally happy to see these trade authorities in the hands of one of his successors? So we have to think about that. There are lots of proposals for the ways that Congress can reassert some of its authorities, cooling off periods before tariff increases, asking for either congressional approval, and so on. And maybe we can talk some more about that in the Q&A.
Wonderful.
Good afternoon, everybody. Judge, thank you for moderating this panel. I'm honored to be up here. I'm obviously the oddball. I'm the one who doesn't have hair. I didn't clerk for the justice. I've never been called a liberal before, John, so I'd prefer to be called Bush's mercenary, which is what the Cuban government called me. But in any event,
That's still pretty liberal, actually.
Yeah, these days, maybe, I don't know. But in any event, it's a real honor to be here, and I appreciate the Federalist Society putting this panel together, because I do think the issues that John and Kristen have just introduced really portend a different period and era of the use of economic and financial levers in totality as part of our policy and economic and legal structure. So I think I really applaud this panel just thematically. What I thought I would do is give a little bit of context, maybe throughput to what John and Kristen have said, and maybe propose a couple of questions, Judge, for us to consider moving forward. One thing to think about is that the last 20 years, especially in the post 9/11 period, you've had a movement toward the use of financial power, largely sanctions, but also other financial and economic levers as a core part of national security. Everything John was talking about is absolutely right. So you think about all of the key national security issues: Turkey, Russia, North Korea, terrorism, counterproliferation. The question of how you use financial and economic measures to unplug America's enemies from the global financial system. How do you make it harder, costlier, and riskier for them to raise and move money around the world? How do you use that as part of strategic leverage, either directly or asymmetrically, is all part of now the national security strategy and doctrine. That really wasn't the case pre-9/11. Sanctions pre-9/11 were really thought of as an alternative to war. As John was saying, that's how it grew up in the post-World War II period, or as an aid to diplomacy, giving teeth to diplomats' words, or just as a symbolic gesture by Congress if we were angry at a country or at a leader. But in this post-9/11 period, sanctions, financial measures, and I'll get into some of these measures in just a second, really became a central part of how we thought about protecting the country and then attacking America's enemies. And this is why you've had this evolution of the use of sanctions, some would argue overuse of sanctions, in the first instance, and even the move by Congress to reflexively move quickly to maximalist approaches to the use of these tools whenever they need a tool to wield. But what's fascinating over the last 5 or so years is that you've begun to see both a legal and a functional blend of these tools. That is to say, sanctions have more and more been focused not just on countries, not just on regime leadership, but on conduct, underlying transnational conduct of concern. And so sanctions are targeted at networks and individuals that are engaged in essence, criminality. So you look at the sanctions programs that are focusing now much more on corruption and human rights abuses. The Global Magnitsky Act and executive order is a manifestation of that. And more you see the use of these sanctions for that kind of criminal behavior. You had it in the post 9/11 period, obviously, with counterterrorism, terrorist financing, counterproliferation. But more and more, we're looking at underlying conduct as the source and reason for the use of these tools. What's interesting about that, among other reasons, is that begins to blend with the fundamentals of the use of other financial and economic laws and tools internationally. In the anti-money laundering context, for example, the anti-money laundering world is based on the premise that we want financial transactions to be transparent, traceable, and accountable, right? We want to know who's doing business with whom. We want to understand if there's illicit behavior. There are reporting requirements of financial institutions, et cetera, that are built as a part of that regime. But that fundamental question of, do you know source of wealth, source of funds? Do you know your customer? Do you know your counterparty? And in recent months in Congress, the question of, do you know the ultimate beneficial owner of a company or corporation? That's the essence of the anti-money laundering system. Can you account for that? Well, that has blended over time with the sanctions regime, with the export control requirements, and now more and more with the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and questions about who's investing in the United States and what's happening with those investments. And so the first point I want to make to you is there's a very interesting evolution here of both law and policy, where sanctions, the anti-money laundering regime, and some of these other tools of economic statecraft and defense have begun to blend in some very important and interesting ways. We do a lot of consulting for financial institutions, and what this does is it puts enormous stress on the financial sector, because they now have to worry about their anti-money laundering systems, their sanction systems, their fraud systems, their cyber systems, all of which implicate these issues. A second point, and related, is that this now converges with what Kristen was mentioning, which is a broader sense of what our national economic security actually means. And so when we think about how do you deal with a complicated case like Russia, which is a major economy in the world, or China, where we're interlinked, the question is, how do you use sanctions or tools? It's very hard to use traditional sanctions the way we have with North Korea or an Al-Qaeda or in Iran, where the blowback or the boomerang effect is not great, can be contained, the externalities are all manageable. Much harder in the Russian context and in the Chinese context. In addition, with the consideration that trade provides a vehicle for other actors to influence the United States or to get investments into key technologies or access to IP, there's a greater sense of vulnerability around those issues. So if you look at the national security strategy that President Trump put out about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, he talks about the defense of the innovation base of the United States as a core national security goal. That's the first time that's ever been articulated that way. And so that's an example of where you have this broader sense of national economic security, such that issues related to trade controls and tariffs, issues of investment in the United States, controlled largely by CFIUS and now a new law, FIRMA, that was passed by Congress. And even on the positive side, the BUILD Act, which gives more revenue to the government to marry with the private sector to go out and challenge the Chinese, for example, with the One Belt, One Road initiative. All of that, to include the sanctions and anti-money laundering rules and regulations, forms part of a national economic security spectrum that is now a part of our strategy. So my second point to you is, the last 20 years were about the insertion of sanctions and anti-money laundering into our national security. We now have national economic security as central to our national security doctrine. A final point, and I think this is important to note, and it goes to John's point about why not use other tools in an environment where other actors are using asymmetric tools, be they cyber, be they information warfare, be they hybrid warfare. You see what the Russians are doing with mercenaries. The idea is this: our enemies that are targets of these measures understand, perhaps more clearly than we do, that they are being attacked with what is, in essence, a power where we hold escalatory dominance. Because these tools, these strategies work because the dollar is predominant as the chief reserve currency around the world, chief trade currency. We have an attractive capital market, the most attractive in the world. We have a system that works. We have leveraged that over the last 20 years in particular for national security purposes. So Iran understands that we're attacking them with our financial system. They've said, we know that we're being attacked economically. In fact, they've said that over and over again over the last 15 years. The Russians threatened, and they said this when Congress was contemplating some of the maximalist sanctions after they invaded Ukraine and Crimea. The Russians said twice, if you pass legislation that unplugs our banks from the global banking system, namely the SWIFT bank messaging system based in Brussels, we will consider that an act of war. Because from a financial perspective, that would be considered a nuclear measure against their ability to connect to the global financial system. So the Russians see this very much as part of a contest and an asymmetric warfare. And I would argue the Chinese do as well. And the Chinese are not only not shy about this, but they themselves have begun to use similar tools and strategies, using access to their markets as points of leverage. We've seen this in the context of Hong Kong, right? Forcing Cathay Pacific to change their policies or to fire individuals. We see this in the context of their IP rules and requirements. And we see this in the context of how they construe their relationships and how they're thinking about One Belt, One Road. So my final point is that America's enemies understand that this economic warfare, these tools and strategies, these things that are considered laws and regulations to us, folks in New York who often complain about them, in the minds of folks in Beijing and Moscow, Ankara, or Pyongyang, it's actually a form of warfare. And it's a fundamental part of how the United States, absent dropping bombs, is able to impact their ability to do what they want to do. And a final point, maybe a slight disagreement with John. Sanctions in their maximalist form and these tools in their maximalist form are intended to change behavior, maybe even change regimes. But they're also intended to do a whole range of other things, right? Deny access to materials, slow programs, maybe create leverage within regimes by pressuring here and not there. So the very strategies and tools that we now deploy, and which Sigal Mandekar did very well, I think, for the Trump administration, is much more nuanced, where we're now not only designating countries or leadership, we are now sanctioning types of transactions. We are restricting kinds of investment and debt. We're doing other things that allows us a lot more nuance and capability to pressure and to achieve things beyond a maximalist goal of a change of regime or change of behavior. So, Judge, let me just end with three kind of areas of consideration. One is the role of technology. Technology is both amplifying our capabilities and potentially denuding us of the ability to use maximum pressure in the international financial system. There's often discussion of crypto regimes, cryptocurrencies, providing anonymity for financial transactions. It's no secret that the North Koreans over the last year or so have been trying to master the access to cryptocurrencies in order to gain access to money they couldn't otherwise through the banking system, to the tune of over $2 billion of cyber heists and activities and attacks. A second question, Judge, is how do the principles of transparency and accountability, which are the hallmark of these systems and what we've used to push regimes and countries to do the right thing, how does that match and conflict with the move toward greater data localization, greater concerns around data privacy, and the reality that in the face of totalitarian or authoritarian regimes, total transparency may be very dangerous, right? And the third question, to John's earlier point about international law and norms, much of the effectiveness and sustainability of these tools comes from a recognition of common norms and principles. A Dutch bank, a US bank, a British bank, they don't want to do business with criminals. They don't want Al-Qaeda accounts. They don't want to be serving as financial facilitators for the North Korean regime, right? So there are underlying norms and principles that drive a lot of this. But are those sustainable? And how do we sustain them in ways that continues to reinforce America's predominance in this space? There's much debate as to whether or not we are losing our centrality in the international financial system, whether or not there are challenges to the dollar, and whether or not there are concerted efforts, and I think there are, by the Chinese and the Russians to create alternate or parallel systems that will create less dependency on U.S. systems, U.S. policy, and U.S. law.
Okay, we're now going to give each panelist a chance to respond to what's been said, and John, you can follow up on specific comments or the general questions that Juan posed at the end.
Sure. So I had three thoughts. One is there is an open debate overall about whether economic sanctions are actually effective. So I think the way Juan and Kristen talked about their use has been in a kind of attrition strategy where you're just trying to deprive rivals, opponents, or movements we don't like of access to resources. When it comes time to actually changing foreign policies, there are a lot of scholars who argue they actually don't, in the end, change nations from a course of conduct that they hold dear. So I don't have any illusions that economic sanctions are going to actually get Tehran to give up nuclear weapons or North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. I think, unfortunately, I think one of the lessons of the administration in which we all served was that the United States will probably not attack a country with nuclear weapons. But if you don't have nuclear weapons, well, if you're within reach of a Tomahawk missile, we might shoot at you, right? But Libya gave up its nuclear weapons, and once they did, we were happy to support regime change under the Obama administration. So one thing is, how beneficial are they and the other odd thing about economic sanctions is, and I think this is addressing Juan's point, is they cost us a lot, right? When we use these economic sanctions as heavily as we are now, we are not just hurting our own economy, right? The China sanctions are clearly hurting our own economy quite a bit, but they also do encourage this reaction of other countries eventually setting up a different kind of financial system. So you might have read that the Europeans in Iran tried to set up their own kind of mini SWIFT bank transfer system so that they could figure out more ways to give Iran money while they pretended not to build a nuclear weapon while they built a nuclear weapon, right? Only the Europeans would want to give away money for that. The cost could be high. We're kind of living, I think when you describe, we're kind of living in the one of the sort of beneficial hangovers of the post-World War II world where the United States did lead the world. We had, at the end of World War II, the United States was about 50% of all world GDP. So we could set up a financial system that ran on the dollar in which all the major corporations of the world were doing business here or we were doing business abroad. Now China is either tied or by some measures a larger economy than we are. The European Union is collectively a larger economy than we are. We are acting in a way like we're acting in economics sometimes the way we act in the military sphere, where we clearly are still the dominant military power, the only sort of global, the only power that can project force globally still. But we kind of act that way with economics. We still want to act unilaterally. But I think Juan and Kristen described, there's a lot of a web of national and international laws that make that very difficult to do, plus the fact that we aren't the world's largest economy anymore. And so the more we use this, the more we're going to generate, I think, these reactions against us. So that's my pitch why this new technologies might be a better solution, because we could achieve the goals of these economic sanctions. Right? So suppose China actually takes some kind of hostile action against us in the South China Sea. Suppose we tried to send a destroyer on these freedom of navigation operations through a territory, part of the world, waters in the South China Sea that China is now claiming sovereignty. And suppose they were to do something like hit the ship with another ship or even sink an American ship. President Trump doesn't want to use force. Economic sanctions are not going to force the Chinese to give up all these artificial islands. So why don't we use cyber weapons to make our displeasure known? Why don't we take the Shanghai Stock Exchange offline for a day? right? Why can't we are unwilling to consider these kinds of options. Why don't we turn off the electricity in Beijing for a day? Look, I just lived through a whole week or two of no electricity in San Francisco. I'll do whatever the Chinese want me to do now to get the electricity back, right? But we are unwilling to consider that, even though we're willing to consider economic sanctions, which, in gross effect and much more clumsy way are designed to achieve that same end. And so that's the thing I think that economic sanctions eventually, and when you talk about technology, will lead us. If we have that same mindset, not using military force, we want to come up with more discreet, less destructive, more targeted ways of coercing other countries. Actually, cyber weapons and information warfare law, these hybrid ways of contesting with other countries are really where we should go, rather than these blunt economic tools, which sometimes may hurt us just as much as it hurts the other country.
Kristen?
This panel is a reminder that John Yoo has a higher risk tolerance than I do. Luxury of an academic. Just to go back to this point, that discussion that Juan and John were having about the kinds of sanctions, I sort of think of them in 3 different categories. There's the attrition sanctions you were talking about, where you're just trying to cut off resources from some bad actor. Then there's the kind of conduct or compliance efforts, where you're actually trying to persuade a foreign government or maybe a foreign non-state entity to take a particular set of decisions. So you're just using it as leverage as part of a kind of broader diplomatic strategy. And then there's you want to burn the place down, that you really, that's the kind of old school, we want to tank the economy, potentially provoke regime change. And I've seen elements of all 3 of these. Iran has used different variations of all of these at different points. We had a period in sanctions which was principally designed to cut off their access to particular kinds of sensitive technologies. Then we moved into a much kind of tougher period of economic sanctions that were designed to get them to the negotiating table. And I think actually succeeded in getting them to the table. I thought the leverage was squandered by the Obama administration, which cut a bad deal. But actually the sanctions, I think, did a reasonable job in changing their calculus. And now I think we're in a period where the Trump administration is prepared to put just really, I think, very tough pressure on Iran with kind of much broader, more ambitious set of objectives. I think there are some things you can do to make them more effective, although I take John's point that the efficacy of sanctions is debated. I think there are other cases where they've worked. One thing, and this is a point actually I've heard you make publicly, is that you have to go into sanctions with a strategy. That there's sometimes, when you're in the US government, sometimes, whatever, the NSC can't come up with anything, so they go to sanctions. And in my old job at the State Department, they would sometimes go to get a UN resolution. And
that was your job.
That was my job. And so anyway, it's, I think you have to go in with a really clear set of objectives about here's how we view success. We have aligned kind of our resources available to that strategy, to that objective, and sort of a clear-eyed sense of chances of success. I think John is right that they ought to be done in concert with other tools, and that can be lots of different things. It can be some of the kind of more aggressive things he's talking about, or just diplomatic pressure. Lots of pieces.
Or we could send Rudy Giuliani to the country.
As I said. I think they're better usually done with others, and I don't mean UN multilateral sanctions. I just mean it's better if you've got some other people going along. If the response of another country to sanctions is, well, fine, we'll just go, kind of work with this other supplier over here, then you haven't done very much. So obviously the broader the better. And I think they're better when they're done in a way that's really sustainable over a long period of time, that a lot of countries set themselves up. There's this period where, in fact, prior to the Trump administration, where sort of Putin was anticipating being at odds with the international community and basically built up foreign reserves for that purpose. These are governments that are sort of, they've got a long-term plan that involves being at odds with us. And so we have to have kind of more strategic patience than they do. And that, which is not our strong suit, in part because our system changes governments and policies a lot. And so to me, sustainability means broad bipartisan support here in the U.S., and it also means a kind of plan that we can really kind of, keep our policies in place over the long term.
Yeah, Judge, I think we're in heated agreement here. What Kristen said, though, is really important, because the question of longevity and sustainability of these measures is critical. It goes to John's point about how much are we willing to risk and harm ourselves in terms of the economy, in terms of American interests where there are sanctions programs. But it also goes to this broader point, and John, maybe this is where you and I disagree slightly, is if we agree that there's a landscape where there's a multiplicity of tools to apply to influence or to attack enemy actors, sanctions and economic levers have to be a part of that mix, whether or not you think they're fully effective or not. And so the question then is, how do you use those tools effectively against competitors and even enemies that are willing to play it out, that are willing to engage in proxy wars, that are willing to engage in asymmetric warfare? Frankly, it's the big debate in Europe around how to handle Russia sanctions, right? That's the transatlantic tension with Europe, because Europe, and we've met with European diplomats who say, well, when does this end? Well, you know what? It might not end if the Russians don't stop their behavior, and if you don't have other tools to push back or even to deter, which is another mechanism and effect of effective sanctions. The threat of further economic pain or isolation has to be credible, has to be sustainable. But there's a real interesting question here, both in terms of policy but also law, given that we're using these tools much more as tools of economic suasion and statecraft, as well as for conduct that doesn't go away necessarily because you've signed some diplomatic agreement. This was the major fallacy, I think, of the JCPOA, and I testified to this at the time when the Senate was debating what to do with what the prior administration had presented, which was this fallacy that you could resolve all the underlying issues that had created the reason for sanctions and isolation against the Iranians with a nuclear deal. That was never going to happen given the concerns of the international system around Iranian risk. So to John's point about what the Europeans were trying to do to set up a humanitarian channel, et cetera, that was independent of the US system, guess what? It failed. It never emerged. No credible bank wanted to be a part of it, first of all, because they were afraid of sanctions, and they were also afraid of the underlying risk. Who are they doing business with in Iran? God only knows, right? And it's probably the IRGC if it's a sector of any significance. And secondly, there is this underlying risk that is embedded in the private sector, which is an important point I want to make, which makes the sanctions and measures of the last 20 years different from the prior 20. And that is, it's the fact that the private sector and the institutions of the financial order have embedded these principles and norms as part of their behavior. Not perfectly. There are bad banks out there. There's bad behavior. There's lots of fines, billions of dollars of fines on institutions, of course, for problems. But for the most part, these banks don't enter into agreements to go do business in Iran, even if their countries are literally telling them to. Secretary Kerry, remember, in the wake of the JCPOA, did a roadshow in Europe trying to convince European institutions, after, by the way, years of our trying to convince European institutions how risky it was to do business in Iran. He went around trying to, in essence, sell the Iranian system so that they would re-enter. Guess what? The European institutions, despite all that, said, no thanks, right? So it's emblematic of this question of effectiveness, because the effectiveness is less about the maximalist approach. And to Kristen's point, you have to have more tools. And to John's point, and I agree, you've got to be more aggressive in other domains. But the effectiveness comes with the fact that you have more allies in the private sector that are actually doing some of this business for us, right? The antibodies are in the system if you know how to animate them and structure them and strategize. And that's why I said I think the sanctions and measures of today are much less blunt, much more effective than in the past. And I think we've got to keep that in mind when we think about a toolkit that we're using to deal with countries. But we've got to deal with all the externalities, to the point made by John.
Let me pick up on a comment you made, John, which is you said that use of sanctions tends to increase congressional involvement in foreign policy. And let me just probe a little on whether that's right, because one of the experiences we had over the course of the Bush administration in non-economic areas is increasing congressional involvement. So if you think of military commissions, we started with an executive order and we ended with the Military Commissions Act, which is a highly reticulated statute that looks like the UCMJ. And in the surveillance area, right, we started with the TSP, executive action, and we end up with a statute and judicial supervision and all. So is there anything distinctive about economic sanctions, or is this just an illustration that our modern legal and political culture tends to like action by rule rather than executive action, even in these foreign policy areas?
Oh, why? You could continue on with more of my greatest hits if there's anything else you want to
Well, my litigation hits too.
But I think actually it's the other way around when it comes to economics, and that's why I worry about the increase in congressional power because of the use of sanctions in setting foreign policy, because in the economic sanctions area, these are not areas where the president went first and said, I'm going to impose sanctions, and then Congress passed a statute to sort of codify what I did. Right? All these sanctions regimes we're talking about are using delegated power from Congress. I mean, I think the happy story so far is that Congress, when it often does want to impose its own discrete mandatory sanctions, as Juan was saying, maximalist sanctions based on the headlines of the day, but often that gets headed off. But in the constitutional realm, right, this is all done because of primarily through the IEPA statute, the International Emergencies Economic Powers Act of 1970. So I'm not sure if I got the E's in the right order.
I always mix them up, too.
Yeah, IEPA statute from 1977. And before that, the Trading with the Enemy Act of, I think it's 1917. But these were all areas where Congress realized they should not be trusted with the power to start imposing sanctions country by country, activity. And so they delegated this huge amount of sanctions authority to the president. But constitutionally, Congress went first and chose to do that. Now, the two things that have arisen, I think, that also show, and before I said that, I agree with, I think, maybe your implicit suggestion is, I don't think it would be a good idea if Congress was to take the upper hand or the lead initiative in running international economic sanctions, even though they constitutionally could. Because I do think, this should come as no surprise, I do think Justice Sutherland and Alexander Hamilton are correct when they said that in foreign affairs, the presidency as a unified actor can act swiftly and stealthily and decisively to protect the national security. The president can impose and lift sanctions based on minute-by-minute circumstances, right? We have imposed sanctions on Turkey, then we've lifted them. Now I think we threatened to impose them just now, but I don't think we actually have, because then how did Erdogan get into the country just a few days ago, right? So I think we did. But can you imagine Congress, how long it takes to pass an act trying to put on and lift sanctions just as to one country, and then how could it do it systematically? I think that would be even worse for the country. So, but some of the things we've been talking about have been provoking these kinds of reactions. So some of you might have seen in the last year and a half, there are members of Congress from both parties that have proposed amending IEPA to subject, the way IEPA works is you declare an emergency, the president declares an emergency, then he accesses all these sanction tools. There are people who want to amend IEPA to make clear that the president's declaration of emergency should be subject to judicial review, and that there should be some kind of statutory criteria for what's an emergency or not. This is a really good idea by Congress to define an emergency before it happens. What could possibly go wrong with that, right? But this is the kind of reaction I think we're getting. But that also is not possible but for the fact that Congress has that constitutional upper hand.
You want to say a few words defending the proposition that Congress should be more active?
Well, first, I totally agree with John that we wouldn't want Congress entirely kind of drawing back all of the president's authority around sanctions, but I do think there's room for them to clarify what they meant in some of these delegations. So, for example, you'll remember that President Trump had proposed to use IEEPA to impose sanctions on Mexico for immigration challenges. Now, there were a lot of people flooding across the border. Like, you can make a really legitimate claim about that, but it clearly wasn't what Congress had in mind when it was talking about when it adopted IEEPA. And you can imagine lots of scenarios where what if a future president decided they wanted to use IEEPA to declare a national emergency around, I don't know, pick your issue, Mexican labor practices or environmental issues, or take your pick. So I do think some constraints around, or at least, a broader understanding of what these, provisions that give the president vast authority mean would be totally appropriate. And to go back to my opening remarks about trade issues, to switch topics a little bit, I also don't think that's an area where Congress ought to take back all of the presidential delegations. I do think presidents need authority to negotiate trade agreements and to impose tariffs in lots of cases. But again, I think there needs to be a broader understanding about what the threshold determination is. President Trump has proposed to use Section 232 around auto tariffs, for example, which is, again, the provision that requires a finding of a national security threat, which, in my view, just doesn't exist around autos. And so, anyway, I do think this is time. We're entering, as I said, this kind of new phase where we're going to need to look more broadly at U.S. trade authorities, about our connection with the multilateral trading system. And so I think part of that is going to have to be a discussion about the tools and also the separation of powers issues.
Can I add more ammo to Kristen against me, just for fun? Was the example
Fire away.
The example that some of the Republican senators give is, what if President Elizabeth Warren declares a national emergency over climate change and then starts using IEEPA to redo the economy? So that's theirs. Yeah.
Judge, the only thing I would add is where you've seen over the last 10 years, Congress get much more involved in the blocking and tackling nitty-gritty of sanctions, is where Congress has felt that the administration is either not trustworthy or just not being aggressive enough to match their sensibilities. And so 3 very clear examples: the passage of CISADA, which was a series of very strict sanctions with respect to Iran, that Congress passed. By the way, usually unanimous, agreement on these kinds of things. When it was sensed that the Obama administration was going soft on Iran, or not as aggressive as possible. You've had the same with respect to the Trump administration and Russia, where Congress has passed elements of Russia sanctions, reporting requirements, and the rest that are very specific with respect to Russia. And then in this latest episode, the threat of sanctions vis-a-vis Turkey, regardless of what the president did in a 9-day span, putting them on and then taking them off, still an ongoing debate in Congress as to the application of sanctions for the purchase of Russian missiles, plus all of the other issues, including the invasion of northern Syria. So Congress in those episodes has intervened and been much more prescriptive as a result of lack of confidence in the stance of the administration or the willingness of the administration to use the tools.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up, and we have plenty of time from the floor, which is, we heard kind of the traditional dichotomy between dropping bombs, which is clearly an act of war, and like a purely economic boycott, which is clearly not. And we heard about a lot of intermediate options, which are more or less edgy, things like the cyber attack. So the question is, at what point do things like that become an act of war under international law, not under Russian posturing? And is that a line we should care about?
So can I just make one more point about the last question?
Sure.
So just one last point about what another consequence of giving Congress a larger hand because we start to emphasize sanctions is actually just does come up with the impeachment, and it's come up with the Mueller report, and it comes up with this Horowitz report, which I'm sure is going to be a great read soon, one of these days, about FISA abuse, is if we start using foreign policy, economic sanctions and money to achieve foreign policy goals, I think it's going to give Congress more power over the foreign policy bureaucracy. And one way to read what's going on with Ukraine right now and impeachment is the Foreign Service is rising up against the president. I mean, I don't know if you've seen this. The White House has ordered these people not to testify to Congress, and they are defying the orders of the president, who is the titular head of foreign policy in the United States, and going to Congress to testify. I think it's just a remarkable example of the Foreign Service going to war or thinking themselves independent of a president and his agenda. I think what happened with what the Mueller report described, or what the FISA report is going to describe, is that is also starting to happen in the intelligence agencies, where they don't think they work for the president. They think they work for the interagency consensus and not the duly elected president. And so can you imagine if foreign policy really starts to revolve around economics, which is under the control of Congress because of the purse and interstate commerce, it is going to make this problem. It doesn't matter whether it's Trump, whatever president's in charge in the future, they are going to have to deal with a foreign policy bureaucracy, intelligence community that they can't trust anymore. So,
this is actually a good time to reference Judge Silberman's article from the 1970s on giving the president control of the State Department, which shows these are kind of persistent issues.
I just hate crediting anyone I've worked for when I steal their ideas. But now that you did it. So back to your question. So this is actually part of why our intelligence and defense communities, I think, are reluctant to start using these other kinds of techniques to pressure other countries like cyber and so forth, because they aren't sure when what they do crosses whatever line there is into the international law phrase, a state of armed conflict. So what they call kinetic, I just love these antiseptic words. The kinetic attacks seem to be acts of war, even very minimal ones, right? If you used one missile to attack another country, like Iran allegedly sending over drones to hit Saudi Arabian oil facilities, it's clearly an act of war. It's kinetic. What our agencies are still arguing about and unsure of is, what if Iran had used a cyber attack to take those same oil facilities offline? So I think there are lawyers in our Defense Department and our intelligence communities who think that too is an act of war. I'm not so sure. Part of my argument is, why should that be considered an act of war when we are allowed to use economic sanctions that actually cause much more harm against other countries, and we don't think it's war? In fact, the UN Charter talks about using embargoes, sanctions, and so on as means short of war. So to me, it means that's an area where the United States has an advantage. We ought to use it more aggressively than we are, and that we should not let necessarily lawyers decide that there's some kind of line that we call war versus peace that we shouldn't cross over that parallels what you do with military force.
All right, let's take questions. The mic is open.
Hello. Okay. Joe Cosby from Washington, D.C. The question is about reserve currencies and how that's going to ultimately affect the power that's going on here. I mean, as it's been pointed out, Russia, actually the EU, China, are all looking for ways to create a new reserve currency so that the United States doesn't have as much power over the financial system and can't use these levers to that degree. So two aspects: where do you see this all going? Are we going to start losing power? How and when? And is there anything that the United States ought to be doing in order to preserve its power in these areas, or perhaps backing off so that it doesn't antagonize others as much as we might be doing now?
I'm happy to take that on. I think there is a debate underway, and in fact, a remarkable speech from Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England, at the end of August in Jackson Hole, talking about that very issue, and even proposing a crypto solution as an alternative, not a basket of fiat currencies, but maybe even a sovereign sort of collective crypto which was a remarkable statement, actually, if you think about it at several levels. But I think it is a challenge, and I think you do have countries like China and Russia beginning to think about this, both in terms of the current system and how to displace it, given the current rules of the road, as well as with new technologies and new systems that they're trying to put into place. And so, for example, creating trading relationships and payment networks and ecosystems that don't rely on the dollar, that are, for example, ruble, renminbi trade in oil as opposed to in dollars. What that does is it doesn't require the conversion into dollars. It doesn't require any transactionality with the U.S. financial system, no U-turn transactions through New York or some other dollar clearing mechanism offshore. And so it begins to pull away the power and the centrality of the U.S. The other dimension of this that's playing out is in the crypto context. And there's no immediate threat that a crypto regime or a cryptocurrency will replace the U.S. dollar or even some other fiat currency. But it's the future potential of different crypto regimes blending and creating broader markets and networks that allow for opportunities for trade. This is a little bit of the allergic reaction that you've seen with the Facebook announcement of Libra and Calibra, this idea of creating a crypto system within the Facebook network and with 99 other companies and associations. And so I think there's something there, of course, that we've got to watch. Near term, I don't think there's a real challenge to the dollar, because the dollar is strong and used because of the attractiveness of our markets, the importance of our trading relationships, the stability of our system, rule of law. So there are fundamental issues and elements and pillars that go to the centrality of the dollar. So I think tending to those fundamentals is critical. The health of our economy, the attractiveness of our markets, the rule of law, but then also finding ways of defining the norms and rules of the road for these other systems that are emerging, where we continue to be the rule setter as well as the central economic player in a lot of these places, or at least challenging where they're emerging. And I think that's really important.
Can I have another one quick point on that? That to one's point, I think right now we're benefiting from the lack of any alternative, that an alternative reserve currency has to be liquid, and Chinese capital controls mean that's not a great option. And Europe, and partly because of the political system, isn't going to be an attractive, just 2 years ago we were talking about collapse of the Eurozone. But that's not, those two conditions may not be kind of long-term issues. And so to Juan's point, I think we have to be very focused. In part, when we apply financial sanctions, we have to make sure that they really matter. We can't kind of overuse it as a tool and incentivize players to wire around use of the dollar.
Hi, I have a question about the variety of ways in which the United States can cause harm to people abroad through kinetic warfare, cyber warfare, or financial tools. Notwithstanding that there may be statutes or norms or treaties that purport to constrain the president's discretion to cause such harms and purport to obligate him to consider the welfare and interests of people abroad, is there any legal authority that rivals in importance the president's ultimate duty and power under the Constitution to promote the national security of the United States?
Why are you guys looking at me? So I think it gets this point of military versus economic. Yeah, sure. And I think it's interesting. The constraints are different based on domestic and international law. So with international law, right, there are these very complicated rules that apply to the use of force, like proportionality, necessity, discrimination, right? But when you use economics, I don't think those rules apply to the use of economic sanctions, as far as I know. There's no requirement, for example, that when the U.S. imposes economic sanctions, say, on Iran, that they're somehow proportional to what we're trying to stop them from doing. And think about discrimination. Remember, discrimination is the idea that when you use force, you are very careful not to target civilians and you reduce collateral damage. The whole point of economic sanctions, unfortunately, is that we are trying to put a massive amount of pressure on the civilian population to get them to change the policies of their regime, or remove the civilian resources that undergird military strength for another country. So economic sanctions actually quite clearly violate the principle of discrimination. So that might be actually another reason why President Trump might like using economic sanctions more than the military option, because under international law policy, the United States just has so much more freedom. We're not going to get criticized as much for sanctions. The Foreign Service may not testify against him as much if he uses economic sanctions versus force. But I think domestically, it's quite different. It's just interesting. Domestically, I think under domestic law, I personally think, and I think history has shown, the president can use force without congressional permission. And so he can bomb Syria, as he has. Right, twice now, in 2018 and 2017. There was like sort of 59 Tomahawk missiles in 2017, and then in 2018 we attacked 3 Syrian chemical weapons facilities. And I was just reading an account for a thing I'm writing about the first attack, and the military leaders were quite proud that when we attacked the Syrian chemical facilities, that we did it at 4 a.m. so not many people would be hurt by our destruction of 3 Syrian. But that's all up to the president. Internationally, they worry about that, but domestically, right? But when we use economic sanctions, then all kinds of domestic constraints come into play, because the president doesn't have the constitutional authority to levy them, only delegated statutory power through primarily IEPA and some of the trade statutes.
Can I address this, Judge, for a second? Because it goes back to your earlier question, too. There's a very interesting dimension of sort of customary international law that applies here, because there are sort of functional limits to how far you can go with economic sanctions. So I agree with John. There aren't law of war principles for purposes of the use of economic authorities, but there are sort of well understood practices around effectiveness and perception of the targets that begin to limit how they can be used. And so the moment I think that sanctions are viewed to be illegitimate, inhumane, don't allow for humanitarian exemptions, all those sorts of things, would be the moment that they stop being wholly effective, where the private sector wouldn't respond, allies wouldn't comply, et cetera. So there's almost an organic dimension to how there are limits. The other side of it is, again, as I said earlier, the enemy that's targeted by these tools is reacting to them in a variety of ways. And so when they're applied, how they're applied is really important. You know, the story around Pearl Harbor is that one of the main triggers for the Japanese decision to attack Pearl Harbor was the imposition of a devastating oil embargo. And that tipped the balance in the decision-making of some of the generals and the leadership in Tokyo. There are other factors too, but that sanction at that moment, in the eyes of everything the Japanese were seeing, was an act of war. And so they decided to take the action in Pearl Harbor. So I think there are elements of the international system that provide boundaries that may not be codified in treaties or understood under UN Security Council resolutions, but are part of the landscape and kind of constrain how we think about the use of these tools.
See, I said you were going to be the liberal in the end.
There you go.
I don't think any of those customary international law norms are legal norms. I think they're good policy, right? When we impose sanctions on North Korea, we allow food shipments too, but it's because we're a generous country. I don't think it's because any kind of law requires it, but I knew Juan would show his true colors sooner or later.
We're all from Harvard, brother.
All right, next question.
Yes, my name is Bill Emanuel. I'm from California, but I'm currently working here in D.C. as a member of the NLRB. My question is, the business press, namely the Wall Street Journal, has on several occasions published editorials warning the president that if he imposes tariffs on countries that we do business with, such as China, but any other company country we do business with, that risks very serious adverse consequences on our booming U.S. economy. And I think John alluded briefly to that at one point, but I'd like to hear your more elaboration on it.
I do think tariffs can risk, have negative economic consequences on the U.S. economy in a host of circumstances. I mean, one might be depending on the retaliation from the other country and, what leverage they have against us. Some of it is just you're raising costs on a U.S. company or a U.S. consumer, and depending on how that hits them in terms of their investment decisions or employment decisions, that can have an impact. And that's why you hear at every Federal Reserve meeting, they mention that one of the key threats to the U.S. economy is the current kind of trade environment. You get this a lot in some of the economic surveys of big companies, that one of the constraints on investment right now is trade uncertainty. Some of them have to make big decisions, like are we going to move part of our supply chain from one country to another country, and that can be expensive. I don't think that's true of every tariff. I mean, I think there's ways to use, that tariffs as leverage without kind of putting your own economy at risk. But I clearly think that sort of if an extended trade war and one that imposes tariffs across lots of sectors and lots of industry, and where there's not a clear signal to companies about where it's headed, I think that can absolutely impose an economic cost.
I think it's
Go ahead.
I think in general, the tariffs are a bad idea. It just calls to mind Milton Friedman, right, when he talked about economic subsidies in other countries. He's like, if he would say something like, well, if China wants to pay its workers to make things for me cheaper than the market price, that's great. I'm happy to have them. Right? Tariffs, if you think about it, we are imposing a tax on ourselves to make products in the United States more expensive. They're just another tax. Why would we want to, if it was just the economy we're worried about, why would we want to do it? They're always going to be harmful to us. So it seems to me the only reason you would do them is certain exceptional circumstances, like you're using them to force a better long-term trade deal that makes trade terms better, expands free trade in the longer run, or you're doing them from some non-trade reason like China. Part of what we're doing theoretically is China is stealing our intellectual property. And so you could say trade sanctions in the longer run are worth it to stop that kind of theft, or they're using entree into our economic and technological systems to steal national security secrets. And we just decide the benefit from that outweighs the economic cost. Where I sort of I sympathize with the Wall Street Journal editorial page and disagree with the administration perhaps is how profligate the administration is with tariffs. I mean, I could see using them against China. I agree with Kristen and once said they are our long-term competitor and rival economically and militarily. But I don't see why we're using tariffs against Canada and Mexico to achieve this, what are we supposed to call it, the USCMA or USMCA or the US Marine Corps, I don't know. But whatever it is, if you look at the agreement, it's really pretty much the same as NAFTA with some changes about the source origins of cars and your manufacturer. It's not that different. Why are we using tariffs against European products? I mean, if you looked at it, even if you took Juan's, or Kristen's point, have a strategy. We should be reaching free trade agreements with all our allies first and then ganging up on China rather than unilaterally putting tariffs on everyone first and then lifting them one by one. That doesn't make sense. So sometimes I think just the economic sanctions are too easy for it to use. They want to show action, so they're just starting to imposing them far too much.
Next question.
Good afternoon. My question is focused on CFIUS and the concentration of power within that committee. I'm not exactly arguing that the U.S. shouldn't be on vigilant against Chinese state-owned companies using mergers and acquisitions to basically do forced tech transfers. But I am concerned over whether Congress has conceded too much power to that committee in the pursuit of economic and national security policy. With FIRMA, it has kind of given Treasury and DOD concentrated legislative, executive, and judicial power to basically police any and all foreign mergers and acquisitions. The problem with this concentration is that I believe it has ended up with too much, it is ending up burning legitimate mergers and acquisitions between ostensibly US corporations and even foreign companies that are not from a hostile nation, like the United Arab Emirates, for instance. More specifically, I'm thinking about like the Broadcom-Qualcomm merger, where you have two US corporations, and they went before the committee, and ultimately the Trump administration shot it down because of concerns from China, which is a little bit hard to find where the Chinese part of either of those corporations are. So my real concern is in our quest for national security, are we running the risk of burning the US economy? And is there a way that we can kind of play this balancing act without tipping off over the edge? Thank you.
It's a great question. It's a great question. And I think it's a fundamental one that we're facing, in part because we're facing a very different kind of competitor, one that is a state authoritarian capitalist system whose global institutions, be they the banks or the technology companies or others, are now entering the international market in force, right? So we're now abutting against the Huaweis, the ZTEs, the Bank of China's of the world, right, of the Chinese system. And they're expanding well beyond the Chinese borders, right? So we see Chinese technology in Brazil and Malaysia and India. And so you're right that there's a real challenge as to how do we think about Chinese capital as it enters the system without doing fundamental damage to our system. I've written about this. I've said, look, we have to devise new systems, and I've been in favor of FIRMA and expanding the role of CFIUS. So just to cut to the chase on that. But I do think it presents some of the risks you've described. How far can the federal government go to determining who and what is invested in the US? And what is a national security priority? What is a national security technology in the age of enormous innovation, where day to day, we're seeing innovation around machine learning, AI, robotics, quantum computing. So what is the government going to define those spheres? Is it going to define the limits of who can invest here or there? So I don't propose to have an answer, but you're right to raise those sensitivities. I think we've got to watch very carefully how the CFIUS process plays out. I also think we have to do this in alliance with our allies, because the Australians, the Brits, Europeans are dealing with very similar questions because of this clash of systems and clash of types of capital that present enormous opportunity, but also potential enormous risk. And so what are the limits to what the government can do to scrutinize and limit? I go back to first principles. I want transparency and accountability in the system. I want to know who's investing in the US. Then we can make decisions as to whether or not it's dangerous or not. A Russian oligarch investing in Manhattan high-rises, I want to know that they're behind the shell company. Whether or not you want to sell the property to them, that's your decision, right? Are they on a list? Is there a reputational risk? You make that decision. But I do want to know who's transacting, who's operating, who's doing business in the US, and in particular, if they're acquiring sensitive technologies, we need to know it.
Yes.
Good afternoon. I have sort of a question bouncing off of some of the concerns that have been raised about China, and it's sort of a worst case scenario kind of a question with three parts. Is if the tables were turned and the United States became the subject of considerable economic sanctions. For example, I just came off the panel, the telecommunications regulatory panel, and they were talking about China's race to become the first country to be 5G powerhouse. And that raises all kinds of concerns in my head about cybersecurity and the like. And so I have sort of a three-part question. Should we be concerned about the risk of a country like China using sort of our own economic sanction tools against us? And if that risk is considerable, what are we doing to prepare for that risk? And what should we be doing to prepare for that possibility? Thank you.
I would say, China does currently impose lots of restrictions on U.S. companies doing business in China. There are plenty of U.S. companies who have kind of robust market share, but in particular sectors, particularly China will have, limits on foreign investment, foreign ownership. They'll use their foreign ownership restrictions to compel U.S. companies to turn over sensitive technology. So basically, they'll say you can only come into China as part of a joint venture, and as part of the joint venture, we want to see your proprietary technology around X. So I already feel like we're well into the area where China is using all of its tools to try to secure a competitive advantage. So there's a principle in kind of U.S. trade law that shows up since 1934 or whatever on reciprocity, and it always bothers me in this period, because the last thing we want is kind of reciprocity with a state-run economy. I mean, there are lots of things we're not going to do, even if the Chinese are doing them, because we believe in free market principles and we believe in open trading system and all of those things. So to me, the real challenge is how do we smartly use leverage to compel, as John was saying, long-term changes in the Chinese system that can make it kind of fairer and more legitimate without kind of absorbing some of the worst elements of Chinese trade policy.
Anybody else?
Yeah, just a quick point on this. I think this turns very insidious very quickly in terms of the economic influence that China wields, and I think this is where we do have some fundamental choices. You saw this play out in the NBA debate around criticism about what's happening in Hong Kong or not. So it's already impacting the way that we think about freedom of speech in the country, not to mention whether or not you turn over your source code as you go to do business in Shanghai, right? So I think it's a really important question. I do think in this regard, we need to think about our alliances differently. That's why I mentioned thinking about an alliance around CFIUS kinds of practices, right? I've talked often about we should have, first and foremost, a Five Eyes CFIUS practice so that the Brits aren't investing in Huawei when we think there's vulnerabilities. We've been talking about this for a long time. Unfortunately, we're now having to grapple with it. But I think we need to think about our alliances differently. The other thing we've seen is these boycott and divestment strategies against our allies, like Israel, right? Which I think we've got to be very conscious of, and I think we've got to support allies that become subject of some of the same kinds of tools, but we've got to give them sort of market backstop.
So I like some basic ideas about China. I think they are our long-term rival, much like the Soviet Union was during the Cold War. The difference is not their intentions. I think it's pretty clear China wants to assume a position where they are a rival superpower in the United States, and at the very least, they want to push the United States out of Asia. I think they've made that pretty clear, and they want to be the hegemonic power over the fastest growing part of the world economy, where we have had long-term interests, both economic and political. The difference from the Soviet Union is that they are an economy that really rivals us. So I was looking this up. The Soviet Union in the early 70s, late 60s, the closest it ever came to the United States, using their own inflated economic figures, was something like 20% of the size of the American economy. And of course, if you added the Soviet Union and their satellite states with the United States and the Western economic system, it wasn't even close. So we had a huge advantage in this very realm, which we don't have now. That is what causes the difficulty, is how do we compete with this kind of Soviet Union-like rival, right, an authoritarian dictatorship with nuclear weapons and global ambitions, when they are closely intertwined with our economic system. So I'm not so pessimistic. I think we tend to exaggerate, however, China's long-term threat in some respects. So, they are, as one pointed out, they are not a market economy. They've become a kind of government-driven, state-owned enterprise economy. I think the figure is something 50% of all industrial production in China is done by state-owned enterprises. Unless Hayek was wrong, that is extremely inefficient. Right, mankind using bureaucracy cannot do a better job than markets and the millions of decisions consumers and producers make. So hopefully, over the long term, the Chinese economy will become more and more inefficient, and maybe we're already starting to see signs of that right now. The second point is they're really brittle. as a matter of political system. There's a reason why they want to watch everybody all the time with closed circuit TV. There's a reason why they're coming up with a social credit score for every citizen. It's because the regime doesn't trust its own citizens, right? This is not a sign of a healthy long-term political system, right? So the thing that's been propping up that crazy system in a way has been giving them access to the Western markets. The economy growing is the only thing that keeps their regime legitimately in power. And so I think, unfortunately, and maybe this is where I think, again, Trump has built a bipartisan consensus, is that over the long term, even though our economies are intertwined, I think the strategically smart thing to do is to slowly disentangle the two systems so that our economic growth is not propping up the Chinese regime's ability to stay in power. Because I think that's really what's going on. Without that, I think you see things like Hong Kong and the protests there are going to spread throughout China if they don't have the ability to say we're providing jobs for everyone and the economy keeps growing. And they've been doing that off their ability to integrate in our world trading system.
All right, we'll take two more questions.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Doug Gates. I'm a law clerk on the district court here. And
My condolences.
But before I was a lawyer, I used to drive destroyers around the South China Sea. So something you said got me to perk up a little bit. I was just hoping for a point of clarification. When you were wondering why we're not considering the use of various cyber options, were you saying that the administration has made an affirmative decision to take those off the table, or rather that we're just not talking about that as part of the public discourse?
So my impression, just from reading public source material, is that at the end of in the Obama administration, we started to suffer a lot of cyber attacks and thefts from state actors. And you could go through the theft of the entire OPM database. We're in Washington. How many of you have worked for the federal government, right? It's easy for you to get your personnel files probably in some marketplace in Beijing than it is by filing a FOIA request now, right? The Chinese have all of our personnel files.
And your
right?
fingerprints.
Right. But there's a number after number of these. And just from the public source materials, my impression is that the Obama administration deliberately chose not to retaliate in the cyber sphere as they could have in an equivalent way. And the reason they tried that, this is sort of gives you the flavor of their vision of international relations, is they hoped that by showing restraint, we would encourage the Russians and Chinese to show equal restraint, and we'd eventually come to an international norm of no first use of cyber weapons. Instead, I think what happened in the very last 2 years of the Obama administration is that China and Russia and their pals accelerated their use of cyber on us. And I think this was much in keeping with the sense of I think the bureaucracy, the defense and diplomatic bureaucracies who are worried about the question that Judge Katsas asked: what if we do things in the cyber sphere that's sort of equivalent to what an active war would be? Are we crossing some kind of, I was about to say red line, but yeah, we know those don't count in the Obama administration, but some kind of line. And so I think because of that, I'm not saying the Trump administration has taken them off the table, but I think there has been a consistent practice of our government choosing, at least the last 10 years, choosing not to use them that widely. Now, hopefully, I would think at least the Trump administration, purely for deterrence sake, to stop this constant level of cyber attacks on our systems, is saying, well, we might consider even doing it, and we just don't know about it.
I think it's worthy of note in light of this question that the Trump administration has used for the first time this term cyber-enabled economic warfare in their national security strategy. That is to say, a recognition that America's enemies, namely the Chinese, but others, are using both cyber and economic tools in combination to undermine American economic interests, and in particular, private sector interests, right? Stealing IP, forcing bankruptcies, using the bankruptcy courts actually to get access to capabilities. So this very idea of warfare kind of blending tools is important in the context of what you described. But I do think there's been a tradition of restraint dating back probably 25, 30 years to not using tools in such a maximalist form, be they cyber or otherwise, that would destroy the sense of stability of the international financial system. Secretary Paulson, former Secretary of the Treasury, used to call this the magnificent glass house, right? You don't want to disrupt the magnificent glass house for which we are largely stewards. And so I think that helps.
So instead, let's just get people to buy lots of mortgages at high rates with no money down.
That's a different story. That's a different thing. But no, to this point, it does demonstrate where the decision has been made from a policy perspective as to how far we will go with these kinds of tools and what targets are on the table for their use.
Last question.
Thank you. My name is Wade Leach. I'm a law clerk to Chief Judge Frank Whitney in the Western District of North Carolina. I'm generally in agreement that we need to move beyond kinetic attacks and economic attacks and where those lines are drawn. But my question is, how do we convince other countries that the law of war fundamentally needs to change to account for those developments so that we can have cyber responses on our own terms? Thank you.
You're going to have to buy my book with Jeremy Rabkin, which is available at a very discounted price on Amazon.com. Although, if you buy it, it's probably been ripped off by a Chinese publisher, and you're just buying some cheap facsimile copy. But in the book, we argue, as far as I can remember, because now I've got Trump on the brain this last year, this is one talked about customary international law. There's no real customary international law here yet. So the most powerful countries in the world have to set the norm. The ones with the capabilities have to set the rules of the road, and they do it by their conduct. And I think here the United States has the ability, but I think it has to come about through deterrence. I don't think the Chinese and Russians are going to stop trying to hack our electoral systems, for example, if we just complain about it a lot. If the Trump administration, takes the Russian cyber agency offline during the 3 days of the midterm elections, that will have more of an effect. And after these deterrent uses of force are used, then eventually you'll get some kind of norm of restraint. But it's not going to be one, I think, that's going to be achieved by proposing customary international law first and trying to hope all the other countries sign on when they can. It makes a lot of sense for them to do what they're doing, because what they're doing asymmetrically negates our huge advantage in military strength. So I don't blame them for doing what they're doing, but we should be deterring them by using the same kind of techniques against them.
As long as we're talking about books in China, the Chinese bought the rights to my book, Treasury's War. I've been in negotiations for the last 3.5 years for the translation of that book. They've continued to want to take out any reference to Chinese involvement with the North Korean economy, such that it's, in essence, denuded a core part of the book.
I read your book for free on a Chinese website just the other day. What are you talking about? It's widely available in China.
So that's right. It's out there if you want to get the bootleg version. It's not coming out officially.
Christian, do you want to hawk a book? Well, if not, then please join me in thanking our panelists.